Okay, everybody, welcome back. We're in chapter 16, section 3, Life During the War. Starting on page 490, American Diary. Drummer boy Delavan Miller, who served in a New York regiment, recalls, quote, "The day after a battle is always a sad one in a regiment. Men search for missing comrades, and some are found cold in death or full of life the day before. No jests are spoken. The terribleness of war has been forcibly impressed on all participants." Close quote from Drum Taps in Dixie. A different way of life. The Civil War affected civilians as well as soldiers. History in You. How does war change the everyday life of citizens? Read on to find out how Americans tried to adjust to wartime conditions. 13-year-old Delavan Miller served as a drummer for a New York regiment. He recalls that, quote, primary source, the great majority of the men really felt that the war would be ended before we had a chance to take a hand in. I may say that the drummer boys, full of young red blood, were as eager for battle as the older men, but most of us had got enough of war before we reached Appomattox. From Drum Taps in Dixie. Life at home. When the Civil War began, Miller, like many other teenagers, left everything that was familiar to him to serve in the military. This meant leaving family, friends, and school. Almost everyone who stayed home was touched in some way by the war. Only about 1/2 of the 12 million school-aged children attended school. Many of those who did not worked to help support their families. Schools closed during the war in some areas, especially those near the scenes of battles and skirmishes. Many schools and churches served as hospitals for the wounded. Shortages in the South. Although the war affected everyone, life in the South changed most dramatically. Both armies spent most of their time on Southern soil, and the South therefore suffered the greatest destruction. Southerners who lived in the paths of marching armies lost crops and homes. Thousands became refugees, and even those who lived outside the war zone suffered. As one observer noted, the South depended on the outside world for everything from a hairpin to a toothpick and from a cradle to a coffin. As the war dragged on, shortages of food, supplies, and even household items became commonplace. Reading check, explaining what problems did the Southern people face during the war. New roles for women, main idea. Many Northern and Southern women took on new responsibilities during the war. History in You. Think of ways that your family would be affected by a war in your backyard. Read to learn the many ways families were affected by the Civil War. Against the advice, I think I might be getting a glare off my screen. I'm not sure. I'm going to close this. Maybe that's better. Nonetheless, okay. Against the advice of family and friends, Kate Cumming, a young woman from Mobile, Alabama, left home to begin a career as a nurse with the Confederate Army of the Mississippi. Cumming was one of the many women whose lives changed greatly because of the war. In both the North and the South, women kept the farms and factories going. They ran offices, taught school, and kept government records. Women suffered the stress of having husbands away at war and the pain of losing family members. They scrimped and saved to make do without many things they were used to, and they prayed to keep their families together. Treating the sick and wounded. In the Civil War, for the first time, thousands of women served as nurses. At first, many doctors did not want women nurses, saying that women were too delicate for the grisly work required on the battlefields. Men thought of nursing as work for males and believed it was improper for women to tend the bodies of unknown men. Strong-minded women disregarded these objections. Mary Edwards Walker became the first woman Army surgeon and later received the Congressional Medal of Honor. Dorothy Dix convinced officials to let women work as nurses and recruited large numbers of women to serve. Another Northerner, Clara Barton, became famous for her work with wounded soldiers. In the South, Sally Tompkins established a hospital for soldiers in Richmond, Virginia. Kate Cumming, who nursed the wounded in Corinth after the Battle of Shiloh, wrote, quote, "Nothing that I had ever heard or read had given me the faintest idea of the horrors witnessed here," close quote. Spies. Some women were spies. Rose O'Neal Greenhow entertained Union soldiers in Washington, D.C. She gathered information about Union plans that she passed to the South. Greenhow eventually was caught, convicted of treason, and exiled. Belle Boyd of Front Royal, Virginia, informed Confederate generals of Union Army movements in the Shenandoah Valley. Some women disguised themselves as men and became soldiers. Loretta Janetta Velasquez fought for the South at the First Battle of Bull Run and at the Battle of Shiloh. Later, she became a Confederate spy. Harriet Tubman, an important conductor on the Underground Railroad, also served as a spy and scout for the Union. In 1863, Tubman led a mission that freed hundreds of enslaved people and disrupted Southern supply lines. Reading check. Making inferences. How do you think women felt about how the war changed their lives? Prison camps and field hospitals. Main idea. When Americans went to war, most were not prepared for the horrors of battle. History and you. What goes through the mind of a doctor or nurse in the middle of battle? Read to learn about battlefield medicine. After the terror on the battlefield, many men suffered the agony of their wounds. Still others faced the humiliation and suffering of being taken prisoner in the hands of the enemy. Throughout the war, each side treated its many soldiers with a mixture of sympathy and hostility. At first, the two sides exchanged prisoners. However, when each realized that the men simply returned to fight again, they set up prison camps. Prisoners were generally allowed to keep their blanket and a cup or canteen when they were captured. These few provisions were all they had during their imprisonment. Food shortages also added to the suffering. Volunteers distributed or gave out bread and soup among the wounded, but in the prisons there was little or nothing to eat. Andersonville Prison in Georgia was opened in early 1864. It was built to hold 10,000 prisoners, but by August, 33,000 were crammed into it. The men slept in shallow holes dug in the ground and daily received a teaspoon of salt, 3 tablespoons of beans, and 8 ounces of cornmeal. They drank and cooked with water from a stream that also served as a sewer. Almost 13,000 Union prisoners died there, mostly from disease. Union prison in Elmira, New York was no better. Captured soldiers from the sunny South suffered through the winter months without blankets and warm clothes. The hospital was in a flood basement, and a pond within the compound served as both toilet and garbage dump. Almost 1/4 of all prisoners at Elmira died. Field hospitals. Surgeons traveled with troops and set up hospitals near battlefields. There, with bullets and cannonballs flying past their heads, they bandaged wounds and amputated limbs. A nurse recalls, primary source, quote, "We have to walk, and then we give the men anything kneel in blood and water, but we think nothing of it." From Kate, the Journal of a Confederate Nurse. The war produced many casualties, and doctors struggled to tend to the wounded. Disease was a constant threat, and some regiments lost half their men to illness before ever going into battle. Crowded together in army camps and drinking from unsanitary water supplies, many soldiers became sick. Smallpox, when it erupted, could be deadly, as could a number of other diseases, including dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia. Reading check. Comparing and contrasting. How are the prison camps at Andersonville and Elmira alike? How are they different? Political and economic change. Main ideas. Main idea. The Civil War led to political change and strained the economies of the North and South. History and you. Can you think of a time when you disagreed or opposed something? Did you take action? Read to learn why and how people opposed the Civil War and how President Lincoln and Davis responded. Throughout the Civil War, numerous smaller civil wars raged in the North and the South. In the South, many Southerners opposed the war in the first place. After 2 years, the war had taken huge amounts of food, materials, and money, and shortages were widespread. Bread riots erupted throughout the South, and as hungry people took to the streets. In Richmond, a mob, mostly made of women and children, gathered peacefully to protest, but soon started smashing shop windows and stealing food. In the North, the Union too had its war opponents. The Democratic Party, which always opposed Lincoln, was split down the middle. The War Democrats were sharply critical of how the Republican administration was running the war. The Peace Democrats, in contrast, argued for an immediate end to fighting. They called for reuniting the states through negotiation. Mostly from the Midwestern states of Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, the Peace Democrats were viewed by some as traitors. This earned them the nickname Copperheads after the poisonous snake. However, by 1863, they proudly embraced this label and wore copper pennies as badges because the coins had Lady Liberty on them. As in the South, some Northerners who opposed the war discouraged enlistment. Occasionally, they went further, helping Confederate prisoners of war escape. Some historians claim that the activities of the Peace Democrats encouraged the South and that the war dragged on because the South believed that the North would abandon the struggle. Jail without trial. As a way of dealing with war opponents in the North, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. This legal proceeding is a protection against unlawful imprisonment. A prisoner uses it to ask for a court hearing to determine if he or she is being held lawfully. The Constitution provides that habeas corpus can be suspended only when in cases of rebellion or invasion. The public safety may require it. As a result of Lincoln's actions, thousands of Northerners were jailed without trials. When people, even supporters of the war, spoke out against the suspension, they were labeled treasonous copperheads. Lincoln's critics were right to be concerned. Although many who were in jail actively helped the enemy, others were simply political leaders who had stated their opinions. In the South, President Jefferson Davis, who suspended the right of habeas corpus, he too believed he needed to deal harshly with opponents of the war. However, by suspending habeas corpus, Davis upset many loyal supporters. In early 1864, North Carolina's Governor Vance wrote him, primary source, quote, "I hear with deep regret that a bill is certainly expected to pass, suspending the writ of habeas corpus throughout the Confederacy, and that certain arrests will immediately be made." Letter to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Draft laws. After the final excitement of the war had disappeared, both the North and the South had trouble recruiting troops. In 1862, the Confederate Congress passed a draft law requiring able-bodied white men between 18 and 35 to serve for 3 years. Later, the range was extended to cover men between 17 and 50. There were several exceptions. If he could afford it, a man could hire a substitute or replacement to serve for him. Later, if a man had 20 or more enslaved people, he did not have to serve. The North at first offered a bounty or a sum of money paid to encourage volunteers. Then, in March 1863, it too passed a draft law. All men from age 20 to 45 had to register. As in the South, a man could avoid the draft either by hiring a substitute or by paying $300. Such exceptions met with great protest. In both the North and the South, people complained it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Anti-draft sentiment led to riots in several northern cities. The worst disturbance was in New York. Was the New York City draft riots in July 1863. Members of the working class, many of them Irish immigrants, attacked government and military buildings. Then mobs turned their attacks against African Americans. Many white workers had opposed the Emancipation Proclamation, fearing that freed blacks would take their jobs. After 4 days of terror, more than 100 people were dead. Federal troops had to be rushed in to stop the riots. Economic effects. The war strained the economies of the North and the South. However, the North, with its greater resources, was better able to cope with the immense costs of the war. The two governments had 3 ways of paying for the war. 1, they borrowed money by selling war bonds that promised high interest. 2, they imposed new taxes, including income taxes. 3, they printed money. Northern money was called greenbacks because of its color. The North prospers. Northern industry profited from the war effort. It produced guns, ammunition, shoes, and uniforms. Farmers proposed, as they sold their crops, provide a steady supply of food. Farmers prospered as they sold their crops to provide a steady supply of food for the troops. However, prices rose faster than wages because goods were in high demand. This inflation or general increase in prices caused a great hardship for working people. Still, the northern economy boomed during the war years. Economic troubles in the South. The war's economic strain was felt more sharply in the South, where wartime destroyed farmland and railroad lines. Also, the blockade prevented the shipping of trade goods. Vital materials could not reach the Confederacy. Salt was so desperately needed that women scraped the floors of the smokehouses to recover it. Food shortages led to riots in Atlanta, Richmond, and other cities. Inflation, too, was much worse in the South. As early as 1862, citizens begged Confederate leaders for help. In North Carolina, citizens wrote desperate letters to the governor. Primary source, quote, "If it is constitutional, and if your position gives you the power to do so, in the name of suffering humanity, of the cries of widows and orphans, do put down the speculation and extortion in this state." From R.L. Abernathy to Governor Zebulon Vance, 1862. Reading check. Determining cause and effect. Describe at least 3 causes of discontent among people in the North and the South. Section 3, review. Vocabulary. Number 1, define the following. Distribute, habeas corpus, draft, substitute, bounty, greenback, inflation. Main ideas. Describing. What role did Sally Tompkins play in the war effort? Which which women played a similar role in the North? 3. Summarizing. Who were the Copperheads? What was their position on fighting the war? Okay, that wraps it up for chapter 16, section 3. Coakley out.